We can finally start, and I would like to welcome you to this webinar on access to medical technologies. My name is Roger Kampf. I'm working in the Intellectual Property, Government Procurement and Competition Division with a focus on health, trade and IP related issues. After the fruitful and in-depth discussions we had last week as part of the webinar on the fusion of health technologies, we are delighted that an impressive number of participants could join us today for what is the second of a series of live events. They form an integral part of the WTO's 2021 virtual course on trade and public health, which is running from 3rd May to 11th June. They are also open to the broader public as a contribution to knowledge sharing and to enable broader dialogue among interested stakeholders. Today's webinar represents the continuation of a long-running series of activities convened by the WTO Secretariat aimed at cross-disciplinary capacity building, drawing together health, trade, and IP experts from across the developing world. Those activities benefit from the well-established and close collaboration with our colleagues from WHO and WIPO. The ongoing trilateral cooperation brings each organization's expertise to the table, thus ensuring a multidisciplinary approach. It aims at gathering empirical evidence in support of informed domestic decision-making. The products of our joint capacity building activities include technical assistance programs such as the virtual course, a series of trilateral symposia, as well as the launch of the 2nd edition of the Trilateral Study on Access to Medical Technologies and Innovation last July. As mentioned by the moderator of last week's webinar, my colleague, Mr. Anthony Taubman, this year marks the 16th edition of the WTO Trade and Health Workshop, the flagship WTO capacity building activity for government officials. Initially focused on the intersections between IP and health, the activity has evolved over the years and now, rightly so, promotes an integrated approach to health, intellectual property, and trade policymaking. This year's edition is remarkable for at least 2 reasons. It comes in the midst of one of the most devastating health crises, and for the first time, its virtual nature allows a broader and more inclusive reach out to policymakers around the globe. The WTO is working in many ways and on many levels in its response to the pandemic. While the webinar will touch on COVID-19, as access to COVID-19 health technologies is obviously the most pressing and immediate concern, it is designed to look at the broader context and build understanding of the systemic factors that shape access to medical technologies in general. It also aims at creating a stronger empirical foundation to effectively address those issues. Indeed, the challenges we face and the experience we have with respect to access to other medical technologies are often very similar and deserve proper coverage in order to achieve public health objectives. For this reason, the webinar looks at this topic from a broader perspective. Access to medical technologies is an issue of vital importance for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular, goal number 3. It is something we must get right in the sense of ensuring that critical technologies from medicines to medical devices are available and affordable for patients in as many countries as possible, while also making sure that innovative activities are incentivized so that progress is made and medical technologies steadily advance. This is clearly a multifaceted theme that requires the involvement of a wide range of policy dimensions and stakeholders at different levels, from national to multilateral. Key elements to achieving those objectives include functioning healthcare systems, adequate financing and intellectual property rights regime that is responsive to domestic needs, effective regulatory approval procedures to ensure quality, safety, and efficacy, transparent and effective procurement systems, and competition policy, just to name a few. The effective deployment of the many policy tools available to governments depends on how they are implemented and used at domestic level. As regards intellectual property rights in particular, their impact on access to medical technologies clearly depends on how they are regulated nationally, and how they are managed by right holders. Pulling the different policy dimensions and options together is definitely what makes this a challenging task for every decision maker. With a view to supporting those efforts, today's webinar will look at the policy underpinnings of access to medical technologies, the challenges of assembling the necessary empirical foundations for sound policy choices, and the practical and policy implications for governments, especially those of low and middle income countries. For this purpose, we will take a closer look at developments regarding access to medical technologies, the critical role of cooperation and partnerships, and the contribution that technology and knowledge transfer, as well as sharing of clinical trial and other data, can make to enhance access. And last but not least, initiatives undertaken to boost local and regional production. Today's event is an opportunity for representatives from government, industry, civil society, and academia to share their perspectives on these topical issues. In addition, colleagues from WHO, WIPO, and WTO will share information on their respective activities aimed at contributing to the empirical foundation that is required for informed decision-making at domestic level. A vital element of the Trade and Public Health virtual course is engagement with leading experts on topics of health technology innovation, dissemination, and access policies and practicalities. While we cannot gather together physically in the same room to unpack these topics, which I very much regret, we want as much as possible to create an informal and interactive framework for discussion. We have therefore also built in time for questions and answers and discussion. So please do put your comments and questions in the Q&A box, and we will direct them to speakers as time permits. To conclude my introductory remarks, I would like to express our sincere thanks to all the speakers for joining us today. Indeed, I have the honor to moderate a session in which some of the most highly valued experts in this field will share their vast experience and knowledge with us. Let me now briefly introduce our expert speakers. Their bios are available on the webinar's webpage, and so I will just keep this to a very brief introduction, and I'm pleased to welcome Ambassador Stephen Cornelius de Boer from Canada, Ambassador Matthias Franke-Schnaber from Chile, Mustaqim Digama from South Africa's WTO mission, James Love, Director of Knowledge Ecology International, Komal Kala, Associate Director for Intellectual Property and Trade Policy at the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations, Sudarshan Jain, Secretary General of the International Generics and Biosimilars Association, Trevor Gunn, Vice President, International Relations, Medtronic, Pascal Boulet, Head of IP and Access, Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, Padmashree Gill Sampath, Senior Advisor, Global Access and Action at the Berkman Klein Center, Harvard University, Irene Kitsara, IP Information Officer at WIPO, Dudit Mubadangizi, I apologize if I pronounced this wrong, Head at the Pre-Qualification Unit at the WHO. And finally, our colleague Da-Yong Yu, who's Chief of Market Access Intelligence Section at the Economic Research and Statistics Division here at the WTO. Let me now turn to our first panel. This will be an opportunity to hear from Ambassador de Boer, Ambassador Franke, Mustaqim Digama, as well as James Love, about developments and challenges regarding access, as well as examples from past experience in which access has been successfully secured. They have also been asked to speak to possible catalysts for boosting access, which are at the disposal of governments and other key stakeholders. Ambassador de Boer, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for that introduction. I wanted to start off by saying that global cooperation is imperative to ensure access to medical technologies, and it's important to understand the role of the WTO in supporting that cooperation. The WTO itself does not build production capacity, transport inputs, manage supply chains, or deliver medical care to people. Rather, the organization's framework of rules governing the actions of its members provides certainty and transparency to those who do. Over the course of the continuing global crisis, those rules have been supported and challenged, both supported and challenged our access to medical technologies. The Trade and Health Initiative, now supported by 51 WTO members, proposes immediate actions on export restrictions, trade facilitation, tariffs and transparency, as well as cooperation between international organizations. This includes a call that members not introduce unnecessary restrictions to trade in essential goods. It also calls for intensifying the work in the different WTO committees to seek solutions for the challenges posed by the pandemic. The work already undertaken in the Trade Facilitation Committee is a good example. Members have outlined how early implementation of the Trade Facilitation Agreement and the use of innovative solutions at the border have helped them to make the movement of goods as frictionless as possible. Enhanced transparency is another area where the WTO can positively contribute, keeping stakeholders informed of policy changes, both restrictive and facilitative. Overall, the Trade and Health Initiative seeks to avoid disruptions in supply chains for essential medical technologies in the near term and to provide a foundation to explore the means to mitigate future trade disruptions to a global health response. This future work means examining the lessons learned from how members have reacted to the challenges of this pandemic. Indeed, we've begun to hear more about the negative effects of the measures taken by members to restrict trade in medical technologies. The industry commentary during the April 2021 vaccine event hosted by the WTO Director General highlighted how export restrictions have reduced the global supply of certain inputs to vaccine production. Similar findings in respect of medical technologies were reported to WHO member states at a recent briefing on an evaluation of the COVID supply chain system. During that session, the presentation by the WHO Chief of Operations and Logistics noted that in early 2020, trade restrictions were a major obstacle to moving critical supplies to where they were needed most. He also observed that export bans further restricted global access to supplies. In this context, Canada sees an opportunity for the members of the WTO to mitigate future trade disruptions by considering what improvements to the framework of rules may be necessary. That is, to consider how the rules interact with and can support or hinder the efforts of the WHO and other international organizations to steer through the current crisis and be better prepared for the next one. In particular, Canada believes that export restrictions should not impede coordinated multilateral efforts to maximize the global production of medical technologies. This is a key building block to ensure the ability of manufacturers to harness all available resources to maximize the production and distribution of the products needed to face the next global health emergency. As we have heard often, the supply chains for medical products, including vaccines, are diverse, and their inputs are produced and sourced around the world. Thus, new multilateral principles of the use of export restrictions for medical supplies could help to guide the trade-related choices members make in the next health crisis. Pandemics have devastating impacts for many economies and local communities, but they are by definition global problems driven first and foremost by health concerns. We are ready to further engage and refine our thinking on how to provide realistic and pragmatic means to contribute to the fight against the current pandemic and create the conditions for better addressing future ones. On the TRIPS waiver proposal, Canada remains committed to seeking consensus-based solutions and welcomes the engagement of all WTO members on this important issue. And Canada supports any consensus-based way ahead on the TRIPS waiver proposal, including text-based negotiations. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your sort of overview of the most important issues in the current pandemic, and also for sticking to the time. That is essential because we have very limited time for the many speakers. So you should hear me again. Before we sort of take questions and discuss the various issues which are brought to the table, I now have the pleasure to hand over to Ambassador Matthias Franke-Schnabach, who's joining us from Chile. So it's very early in the morning for you, Matthias. And thank you very much for being with us and sort of sharing your perspective with participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Yes, it is early here in the morning, but it's supposed to be a nice day. I'm looking outside, still dark. Let me go from a different perspective of Ambassador de Boer. Let me tell you a bit about our experience. No, in the early 2000s, so 20 years ago, there was a lack of links between industry and science in the Chilean ecosystem. The response of the government was to create the program, the Bicentennial Program on Science and Technology, with the following objectives: to develop an effective innovation system, to increase human capital of excellency in the science and technology sector is a critical condition for a knowledge-based economy. Third, to strengthen the links between the scientific community and the uses of scientific progress from both the public and private sector, and to strengthen the relationship between local research and business communities with their global counterparts. This program was based on the Australian model of cooperative research centers program established 10 years before ours. The Bicentennial Program was launched in 2003, and it was structured under three pillars: to improve the science, technology, and innovation system, to strengthen the scientific basis in the country by increasing the human capital, capacity, and infrastructure, and to access in a timely manner foreign knowledge. And third, to foster private-public partnership, including customers and users. So I will focus on this third pillar. The justification for this kind of instrument is to address some of the market weaknesses or failures affecting entrepreneurial innovation. This line of work, the public-private partnership, is implemented through three programs: the insertion in global networks, the incorporation of researchers into companies, and through technological business consortia for research. Let me focus on the last one. This consortia group companies that associate among themselves or with universities or technological center with R&D capacity, with the objective to bring to the market the result of technological research in the form of a good or service. The idea is that researchers reach a point where they can understand the needs of the productive sector, and the productive sector can understand the relevance of research in the business strategy. In almost 2 decades, projects that total around $120 million have brought together more than 100 Chilean and foreign private companies and 40 research institutions. Early on in the program, the biomedical sector was considered a strategic one because of its high technological risk and the important research capacity already existing in Chile. One of these consortia is the Biomedical Research Consortium Chile, created in 2007, was the result of association between the Catholic University in Santiago and the Corporación Farmacéutica Recalcine, a big Chilean laboratory by then, and other important pharmaceutical companies. The aim of BMRC, as called the consortium, is to develop new technologies to solve human health global problems through R&D programs and bring into the market the final concrete results. The consortium works in 3 areas: diagnosis, treatment, and vaccines. Let me focus on vaccines. One of the most promising projects is the one related to respiratory viruses. So now maybe you're realizing where I'm going to. BMC developed the first vaccine in the world to prevent the human respiratory syncytial virus, or RSV. With this experience, new development platforms have been produced, for example, against the human metapneumovirus, HMPV, and currently they are working on a vaccine to prevent COVID that could be administered to infants. Logically, their experience and the creation and strengthening of local R&D capacities in the biomedical sector led to BMRC to a very important project to conduct clinical trials in Chile for Sinopharm Coronavac COVID-19 vaccine. The fact that one of the most prestigious universities in Chile, the Catholic University, is part of the consortium helped to increase trust in the Chilean population on the safety and effectiveness of the Chinese vaccine. Additionally, it provided the government with a bigger leverage in the procurement process of this vaccine that has become the main type used in the Chilean COVID-19 inoculation program. It also accelerated and improved of infrastructure processes with international standards, as well as change in the regulatory framework that in the past had become an important obstacle. And finally, last but not least, some of the gaps in the product development phase on the value creation process have been reduced through this process. So I think I will stop here, Roger, and open, of course, for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. I think this was exactly the kind of sort of input we were looking for. Examples, concrete examples of how to sort of bring forward sort of the marketing, the development and marketing of new pharmaceutical products. And I think you've given us a good overview of what can be done at national level if the policymakers are behind such projects. So thank you for this input, and I hope you can stay with us for a little while to listen to the other speakers and also to engage in the discussion. So this said, our next speaker on the list is my colleague and friend, Mustaqim Digama from the South African mission. So Mustaqim, the floor is yours to share some of your insights. Thank you.
Roger, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to participate in the events that the WTO is organizing. It's very difficult to talk about access to medical technologies without looking at COVID-19. And I'll try to break up the presentation in 3 parts. I only have 5 minutes. Initially, I think I just want to look at COVID-19 and the impact. I think for many of us, it's forced us to think differently about access, about the incentives, and about the legal frameworks that enable access to technologies. Now, of course, South Africa is a co-proponent of the TRIPS waiver proposal, and the current dynamic really bears out some of the points in respect of the application of intellectual property rights, but it would be dishonest of me to really say that intellectual property rights are the only issues. We have seen currently that there are many other capacity constraints that would need to be addressed. So in a very forthright way, the waiver, even if it is passed, requires a further global cooperation. And so from that point of view, I think this discussion is timely. And I think if we are really committed to try to address issues to access to medicines, we should not only focus on the short-term solutions that we are proposing within the waiver context, but also to look to build up after the pandemic is over. And so from this point of view, I think the pandemic has seen a very rapid deployment of technologies during this time. And much of it has benefited from state funding and global cooperation. And this is an aspect, I think, that we should try to capture and build into further collaboration that we could suggest. Now, of course, also, how do we really promote equitable access to medical technologies? Well, in this regard, I wanted to emphasize 1 or 2 points. The first being that if we look at the existing framework, we need to relook at how we position particular types of rules that could apply. And so from this perspective, I believe the waiver already gives us some indication. If we wanted to ramp up production, we need to ensure more effective technology transfer. We need to ensure more effective cooperation. How do we do that? Well, we've been very clear: implement the flexibilities, even though we argue that these flexibilities cannot effectively be used during this time. We believe that on a national level, implementing these flexibilities are important. South Africa has embarked on a road to update its intellectual policy framework, and we are actively implementing this. So countries must take advantage of the flexibilities that are presented. Whether these are enough is an open question, and I think currently current statistics and current experiences may certainly put some more light on this. Obviously, also, we believe that the issue of transparency on contracts, price stability, and so forth, these are all issues that hinder discussions on access. And I think in the last few years, there's been a lot of discussion on transparency in access to medical technologies and so forth. And so from that perspective, we believe that further discussions could be had. But what are the core elements that we could agree around? Well, firstly, I think the sharing of public knowledge has been really encouraging. So public disclosure of gene sequencing, timely publication of clinical results, also to ensure that governments and other funders that contribute to the development of such technologies would also have certain safeguards in place to ensure that innovators are held to particular types of standards when it comes to pricing, disclosure, and so forth. And then, of course, the global use of non-exclusive licenses could perhaps also be something that can be looked at. And the promotion of technology transfer is really critical. In ending, Roger, I just wanted to emphasize that South Africa has had some success in implementing strategies around using competition, for example, to address abuses of intellectual property. We've had a market inquiry that has led to further recommendations on how we can manage the inappropriate and monopolistic use of intellectual property rights. And so from that perspective, we believe that going forward, we would have to have a synthesis of all of these particular factors. I see my 5 minutes are up. I'll leave it at that and happy to answer any questions that may follow. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you very much, Mustaqim. I know it's a real challenge to stick to 5 minutes, and you've managed to do so while covering a wide range of issues which are pertinent for access to medical technologies. So thank you for sharing your perspective with us. Now, the final speaker on this panel is Jamie Love, Director of Knowledge Ecology International. And Jamie, you are now on the floor to share your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to such a distinguished panel. One of the issues that countries deal with in trying to promote access are granting compulsory licenses. And I think that for a lot of countries, I've dealt with compulsory licensing cases in a number of countries. I've dealt with them, cases in Chile and South Africa and India, in Thailand, in the United States and Canada, the UK, around the world. And they're very difficult to get countries to actually intervene against the exclusive rights of a patent. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. Well, what are some of the problems? Well, for a lot of countries, they have compulsory licensing statutes on the books, but they haven't used them before. And often they just lack experience. In some cases, the governments have to adopt regulations to the statutes before they even use the statutes. Sometimes there's a lack of clarity in terms of the lines of authority to implement a compulsory license. If you were to ask a country, that wants to override a patent on a therapeutic, for example, for COVID-19, like remdesivir, countries may be confused about whether that's up to the health minister, is that the patent office, is the Minister of Industry and Trade. And those things often have to be sorted out. And that can cause a considerable amount of delay, and people have different interests. Like the health ministers may have one way of thinking about something, but people in the Foreign Office or the Patent Office may see things differently. In the case of South Africa, it was actually the Competition Commission that worked on the Hazel Tau case in 2003, because other parts of the government were really not interested in moving forward on that type of initiative. There's often sometimes when they get to the point where they want to issue a compulsory license, they may have some confusion over how to set compensation, how to do royalties. These are things that can be overcome with experience and time. And once countries have done it before, often the first case that they do becomes a huge precedent for whatever follows afterwards. So sometimes the details of the initial cases can be quite important if they're to progress. Often countries are not prepared for the political pushback they get from doing so. They may be contacted by the United States government, by Canada, by Switzerland, by the European Commission, by Germany, different countries. UK may sort of push back when they try and do something to compulsory license, even though the bulk of compulsory license have been done in high-income countries. Germany has issued compulsory licenses on several products, HIV drugs. I was involved in a case that involved a rare disease drug, Fabrazyme. There was a case in Germany. Canada right now has a case for COVID-19 where the Canadian government has been opposing the compulsory licensing case. They have refused to put COVID-19 on Schedule 1 of the patent law, which is a precondition for even applying for a compulsory license to export. And another set of problems has to do with the procedures for exporting. Now, a lot of the most important legal issues in the TRIPS waiver debate have to do with Articles 31F and 31 bis of the TRIPS agreement, both of which deal with exports. 31F puts a restriction that you can't export more than 49% of your production, which is an insanely bad idea. And of course, as you can see in a pandemic, to be restricting exports of drugs or vaccines manufactured under compulsory license. And Article 31 bis was really the result of a really bad negotiation, and it was a cumbersome, complicated thing, which I don't have time to go through all the details right now. But the fact that it's only been used once since 2003 should illustrate really how challenging it is to use. Now I have about 19 other talking points I wanted to address, but I only have 30 seconds. And so I'm going to wind up a little early right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. And I think it's also sometimes beneficiary if you focus on one particular topic, which you have done, and to set out, the issues which are related in this case to compulsory licensing. Just an immediate comment on what you said about 31 bis. At least you have seen this as others have. We have now first notifications coming in from countries of notifying their needs in terms of vaccines for COVID-19. So it seems to be a tool which can be used, and first steps are made in this direction. Now, I'm just looking at, do we have questions from the floor at this stage? No. I would actually have, if you allow me, I would have a question which relates directly to what you have elaborated, Jamie. And this goes to the other speakers as well. What support is actually, in your opinion, needed to effectively implement and use the IP system, including the policy options, so that we support access to medical technologies? Because it always leaves me a bit sort of puzzled when after so many years of capacity building and technical assistance, we are still not there, it seems, as the examples Jamie has given seem to show. So what should we do differently, and what is needed in order to make this work effectively? Is there any taker who would like to answer that question? Jamie, you want to go first?
We've suggested one initial thing that the WTO could do in terms of the current situation is to have a model law to deal with pandemics. TRIPS agreement in Article 31 does say that in the cases of extreme urgency or emergencies, things that would fit the pandemic, that some of the normal conditions on a compulsory license don't have to be followed. Like, for example, there does not have to be prior negotiation on reasonable commercial terms. On the other hand, the restriction on export still does apply in Article 31. there are other avenues that countries could take. When the U.S. wants to issue a compulsory license that deals with exports, as they've done a lot of times out in the medical device or in the technology field outside of the drug area, they've done it as a limitation on remedies. And countries, I think, are unfamiliar with the idea that an alternative to granting an exception to the right, the exclusive right, is to grant an exception to the enforcement of the right in certain cases. In particular, what the U.S. does is they will withhold an injunction in cases where there's an export of a patented product without the permission of the patent owner, as long as there's a compensation paid to the patent owner. So there will be compensation to the patent owner, but no enforcement of the injunction in cases where it's clearly the case that the infringer is going to export the product. That's a workaround for the problems in 31F and 31 bis. Now, a model law is controversial because the rights owner thinks if the WTO has a model law, it will be very influential, and a lot of countries will implement it because they will not be worried about violating the WTO rules if it comes from the WTO itself, and it will sort of advance and almost sort of seem like it was endorsing the use of compulsory license. But it's clear in the case of the pandemic that very few countries that have national laws are laws that are really well adopted for a pandemic. And beyond that, though, there are other issues having to do particularly with the registration of drugs and test data, where these are important. For example, in the Canadian case, it's very difficult to find out how the Canadian government, in its own export and compulsory licensing law, would allow a product to be registered when they will not allow a reference product to be used for a biosimilar or a generic version. And so getting beyond merely the patent issues and also looking at the test data and the regulatory barriers would be a really useful thing in a model law.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for those insights. Can I just maybe turn the question to our other three panelists? You've all, in one way or another, sort of referred to the various elements and factors which are needed either to address the pandemic or more generally to sort of make sure that access to medical technologies is possible. How would you actually see, I mean, the way forward in terms of an integrated approach that somehow takes all of these points into account, and how can this be best implemented? Is there any idea which you would like to share on what is the way forward? Ambassador de Boer, you are the first one raising the hand, please.
Well, I fear sometimes that it isn't particularly sexy or particularly innovative, but I thought it was very instructive when the DG engaged in her third way discussions with industry and stakeholders. And when we're talking about vaccine production, it wasn't simply, I don't mean to diminish the intellectual property aspect of it, but there were some of the more mundane aspects of international trade, or you might consider them to be mundane, that are absolutely essential for vaccine production. We know that there are inputs going into these vaccines from multiple countries. And the way this is going to work is getting out of the way of the trading in those components. And that means facilitating trade. That means not having goods stuck at the border. That means not being subject to export restrictions. So it's a little bit old-fashioned, I suppose, but these are real issues. And when we listen to what was being said in the DG's discussions in April, this was coming up time and time again. Things weren't being labeled properly. They weren't clearing customs fast enough. They were sitting on docks. They couldn't get the inputs because of export restrictions. These are bread and butter issues, and they're extremely critical. And we need to have a discussion about this, and we need to be working harder to get out of the way of these production processes. And sorry, this is not just limited to vaccines. This is also a huge issue with respect to PPE. And we know that, we've seen that, and we've experienced that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Matthias, you have raised your hand, so if you want to come in, please.
Thank you. I raise it in an old-fashioned way because I cannot find the button here to raise it electronically. Yeah, I fully agree with Stephen. No, and that's what we are doing in the Ottawa group. No, that's the work we have done, and on this event or dialogue with the industry was clearly the IP wasn't even mentioned by the industry. It was mentioned from the point of view of innovation. But I don't want to have to center the discussion on access or the waiver or IP. I think I go back to the leitmotif of this webinar. No, it's access to technology. I think we have to go back to there. Access, the waiver, and all the discussion. The only thing we'll do is to continue this. How do you say that? The developing countries that will not get access to the technology or the correct technology. No, the dependence of developing countries, they may access new vaccines, new medical goods, but not in the technology. No, to get to that point, you need to have something different beyond access, beyond compulsory licensing, beyond voluntary license, beyond waivers. And I think if you look to experience in the world, Korea, Singapore, they've done a state or government country strategy to incorporate technology. So transfer of technology is not something that will come automatically. And in some cases, you need to have a national strategy. You need to have certain capabilities. You need to have a regulatory framework in order to do that. So when the technology comes, you can get the best use of that. And our experience in Chile is that no, we haven't had the appropriate framework, the appropriate ecosystem in Chile. So to benefit of the technology, to benefit of when technology comes through any kind of a licensing agreement or any kind of other way. So you need to have that ecosystem behind that. I think what the literature calls the technology mastery capabilities. That's the way you will benefit of transfer of technology if you have this mastery technology capabilities. Otherwise, you, developing country, will be dependent on foreign technology, even though they may have access, even though they may produce vaccines. But if they don't have the ecosystem and the capabilities, and again, it's a government strategy, with priorities, very clear priorities, with appropriate regulation and legal framework, those access probably will not mean too much in terms of changing the dependency on foreign technology. That's what I can say about this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Mustakim, before we move on to the next panel, would you like to add some final words to this panel?
Roger, yes, thank you very much. Maybe I'll just take a little bit of a different perspective to Ambassador de Boer. I think if we look at the discussions that we've had in the last month or so, the one very important issue is that IP definitely is something that we need to address. It's not the only issue, I would agree with that. I think in recent times we've seen export restrictions, we've seen issues around regulatory issues that would need to be addressed. But I think if we wanted to be honest about this, we would need several initiatives and several efforts to clarify specifically how TRIPS flexibilities apply, not only in pandemics, but I think there's further work that needs to be done in that regard. Also, as mentioned, the Trade in Health initiative perhaps focuses on trade. And we've seen that trade is important, but we've also seen that the barriers to members benefiting from trade are also pronounced. And so beyond trade, there's also issues around technology transfer. How do we deal with that? In the WTO, we've had discussions around how do we facilitate technology transfers to LDCs, but clearly many developing countries would need assistance. And so from that point of view, I also think that a greater focus on how we can transfer appropriate technology through appropriate platforms is also going to be important. We see a broad array of proposals being made in the World Health Organization and beyond in regional groupings. So how do we get Africa prepared to take advantage? These are all things that need to be addressed. And so from that point of view, I think there's a lot of work to be done. And certainly I would not dismiss some of the concerns that have been expressed, but necessarily all these things are relevant. It is not just to focus on one thing, but we need to focus on everything in a systemic way in order to ensure that there is the necessary balance and access. Thanks, Roger.
Thank you so much, Mustaqim. And you see that I got passionate because we are already 10 minutes behind time. I would love to continue this discussion, but unfortunately, we have to move on now to the next panel. And actually what Mustaqim said is a very nice sort of transition into what is the theme of the second panel, because we heard a bit about technology transfer, that, you know, this requires the necessary ecosystem needs to be sort of considered which platform is actually useful or helpful in order to ensure that this transfer takes place. So here we are with the second sort of panel discussion, which is sort of built around cooperation and partnerships, and specifically focusing on transfer of technology and know-how and sharing of data. And so I'm very happy to have Trevor Gunn as the first speaker. He's representing Medtronic. This is actually interesting for us because when we talk about access to medical technologies, I think in most places we have the sort of traditional medicines, small molecule medicines, biomedicines in mind. But he has an industry which is, I think, equally important, the medical devices industry. And Trevor, so we are very sort of interested to hear from you what you have to say about cooperation and tech transfer. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Roger, and thank you, colleagues, for the presentations on the previous panel. I represent Medtronic. In a moment, I'll tell you a little bit more about us. We can go to the next slide. So if you think about medical technology in general, it really is almost anything under the sun other than nurses and doctors, everything from tongue depressors. We can go to the second slide, please. Tongue depressors to the more advanced medical technology, for sure. So a lot of things that classify, but one thing that medical technology is not is pharmaceuticals or biotechnology, I think is, I'll make the point in a moment. We can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So, you know, no matter where we're working in 160 countries in the world, and particularly because people may not have hard science experience, we still have a resolute confusion between the medical technology and pharmaceutical industries. We're not suggesting that one is better than the other. We're simply saying that there's about a 10% overlap, perhaps, not only in the players, but in the technology and a variety of other places. In fact, this is an extremely simplistic side-by-side comparison between the two industries. Much more appropriate if you cannot focus on what the medical technology actually brings intrinsically and what motivates. And the way I say it is people dislike the medical technology industry. You want to know what the levers are that you can use with that medical technology industry, and thus you have to see the industry for what it is by the nature of it, how the invention actually works. So the next slide, if I could please, we're much, much closer to information technology. In fact, you know, our proximity or likeness to information technology is validated by our involvement, my direct involvement, in fact, in ITA2 negotiations with the WTO facilitated. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's a one-to-one equivalence, but particularly in terms of information, particularly in terms of advanced medical technology, there is a near one-to-one equivalence. And when we talk, we're almost like an IT firm with medical purpose. There, I'm giving a talk at the WTO celebrating the 20th, I think, anniversary. I think that was of the ITA2, right at the bottom there. Okay, we can go to the next. Right, so let me just be very clear. So I'm speaking for Medtronic, but certainly I've cleared this with some of our trade associations. I really want everybody to come away with the thought that we really have one single mission, and that is to get medical technologies to all who need them. We're not perfect. We're making attempts. There is a market, heavy market forces there, and we have to do that. But at the end of the day, we are very, very keen to do the following, which is that we really fundamentally believe in our industry, that anywhere anyone can bring those innovations. You also have to understand that we are not a large company industry. In fact, 85% of the companies are small, medium-sized companies, a doctor that speaks to an engineer and they come up with a new innovation, they bring it to market. So some of the discussions that we have are maybe appropriate to the larger companies and maybe in other industries. And we're a small, medium-sized business industry. Medtronic is the largest in that industry. We're the inventor of the pacemaker. We're also the largest producer of respiratory devices. Together, today we manufacture 131,000 medical technologies at Medtronic. That said, we are an outlier in the industry overall. We're not constrained by any particular paradigm, and that's very important. We want more medical technology companies, particularly from emerging countries, to come up. We want to be a force that helps them to come to global markets, as opposed to just staying locally. You know, access to, and you talked about this before, some of the panelists, access to medical technology takes a whole ecosystem. You have to have doctors, nurses, infrastructure, and so much else in order to get proper absorption, particularly within public healthcare systems. That's why medical technology, for example, in Africa, advanced medical technology particularly, is very, very slow to come. And if you look at medical technology as a part of the overall expenditures of the healthcare system, it's much, much less than some other areas. So only 7%, whether you're in the public or private sector, or when you're in emerging or developed markets, it's within about 1%. Now, speaking about Medtronic, we've been in deep discussions with the UN Technology Bank. Actually, we have an MOU signed with UN Technology Bank, so we're very open-minded about this. We have very good discussions with our friends at the WHO. We have direct activities that are both in Africa and in Bhutan as a starting point. And I would also say that I'm sitting on the advisory board of the IFC World Bank, where we're literally trying to help new innovators coming to market with new technologies, many of them that have actually come out just during COVID-19. And no one's mentioned CTAP. We're very open-minded to this. We think that there's a lot more calibration that needs. We're not in a position today that we can actually make a decision around this as a company or even as an industry, but we're open-minded there. And then finally, we founded something during the pandemic called the Global Respiratory Partnership, and we can talk a bit more about that. We can go to the next. And Roger, I cannot see the timing. I know I'm probably out of time. We can go to click one more time. Click one more time. Yes. Oh, there's the time. Can we click one more time? Because there's one more piece of the slide. So this is, well, let's keep, okay, so good. So this is just Medtronic's, and I will pass the overall case to everybody here, but Medtronic acted in a very, I suggest a very different way than most did during the COVID-19 crisis. We openly sourced our PB560, the lowest acuity ventilator. We, as I said, helped to found the Global Respiratory Partnership, which does not have a formal relationship with the WHO, but we can talk more about that if you'd like. We collaborated with a lot of others. We took there was huge need for training amongst a lot of professionals, still is today. We founded something called the Ventilator Training Alliance. We took 27 of our competitors and through an app basically made that available. We're actually translating it right now into Hindi, of course, because of the Indian situation. And finally, the last slide we can just put up there, and then we can send these around. Everyone is quite interested in this. This is our lowest acuity ventilator. This was not sitting in some back room with a bunch of cobwebs on it. This was an active ventilator for low acuity situations. 250,000 downloads by 250,000 unique institutions here, and resulted in partnerships we have today in Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, Canada, and a variety of other places in the world, probably academic institutions, maybe some government institutions we don't even know about, which was the exact intention. It was not limitless. There were certain parameters around it, but I'm certainly very, very happy to answer any questions. And Roger, I'm sorry I've overstayed my welcome because I didn't see the clock until very late. Thank you.
No problem, Trevor. Thank you very much also for giving us these multiple examples of how collaboration can actually be implemented on the ground. I think that is sort of useful by way of practical experience to share. And with that, I will now sort of give the floor to our second speaker on this panel, Mrs. Komal Kala, Associate Director from sort of and responsible for IP and trade policy issues at the IFPMA. So Komal, you're joining us from India, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you for having us, and thank you for the previous speakers. You know, Trevor mentioned that there is a slight overlap between our industries, and I think where it overlaps is the complexity and the technology involved, and even the further complexity that is involved in the access and deployment and distribution of that technology. And Roger, I'm going to go slightly off script, so please forgive me. I know you said not to talk about COVID, but I think this the situation that we're in. I do need to underscore that there is a system that is in place that we have to work within, and so there are certain things that we can do short term. However, having come out of this, and I think the ambassadors alluded to this, there are certain long-term things that we could do. You know, we could put in principles that could actually access technology diffusion in countries that need it. And we've seen that happen in the pandemic. So for the short term, and as previous speakers have alluded, I think industry has been front forward in, enabling the technology that they have, thanks to the IP rights that we have, to bring forth some of the fastest ever viable vaccine candidates that we have today. I mean, let's not forget that in December, we didn't even have one. And today we are talking about 2 billion doses with several vaccines in the market. Now, this has been possible only because of the collaborations that we've had. And the reason why we've been able to do this, and I see Mr. Jain here, but we've also collaborated with several developing vaccine manufacturing companies as well, is because of the expertise, the experience, and the capabilities that our partners have. They may be few, but these are the ones that have been able to scale up, and that is why we are on board to producing 11 billion vaccines, hopefully by the end of this year, shot a little above 11 billion, which hopefully can be enough to vaccinate the entire adult population. And just today, I'm very happy to announce that the global industry has announced further steps to maximize production of vaccines. And there are 5 principles in these roadmaps that we've identified. And so I'm just going to quickly read those. One is, of course, step up dose sharing. And I'm very glad to see that some countries have started. It's a small step, but we hope that more continues. We want to continue to optimize production through our collaborations, but at no point compromise on safety and quality. We need trade barriers to be eliminated, as was mentioned, and strengthen global supply chains. And more importantly, we want to contribute and support country readiness. And that goes into the long-term aspect. And that is all underpinned by innovation. We should also mention that we are working with WHO through the ACT Accelerator and the Manufacturing Task Force. We are, of course, in touch with WTO, and we welcome the DG's third way and the work that the Ottawa Group is doing. Now, in the long-term perspective, I think the ambassador from Chile alluded to this, is that you need an ecosystem to work. So if you want to have capacity, capability, and distribution networks and technology diffusion, there are 8 principles that are required. You need to have a viable and local markets. You need political stability. You need the rule of law. You need appropriate innovation-friendly incentives to be in place. You need access to innovation, a high regulatory framework, skilled workforce, and a clear economic policy. So I know I've rattled through this, but I do also want to underpin is that and I think this is a question that gets often asked, sorry, I'll just take 30 seconds, is that how do you choose your partners for technology transfer? It's very simple. You need someone that can absorb the technology, which means that they have to have expertise and experience and the ability to scale up, and that they are trusted partners to make sure that at regulatory side, nothing really goes amiss, so that, you know, the scarce resources that we have are not misused or binned. And we've seen examples in the current pandemic. So long term, we have to make sure that this does not happen. Thank you, and thank you for the extra 15 seconds.
Thank you very much, Komal. Can I just correct one thing, not to give any wrong impression here? What I said when we had sort of an initial meeting with the speakers was this particular event or webinar should not exclusively focus on COVID-19, because it should actually place those issues into the broader context of access to medical technologies. So by no way did I mean to shy away from discussing, you know, COVID-19 related issues. I just wanted to make sure that we have the broader picture, in which, of course, COVID finds its proper place and must find it. So just to correct that, not to leave any wrong impression out there. With that being said, and Sudarshan, thank you very much for being with us. You're also on the late hour side to share sort of your perspectives with us again on cooperation, sort of partnerships and technology transfer. I think you have a good sort of point to start from. You know, what the previous speaker said is probably a good way for you to pick it up from there. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Roger, and it is great to be part of the panel with Komal and Trevor. It is indeed my privilege to be there with them. What I'd like to do in a brief time of 5 minutes, I will just briefly set the context and give 4 approaches of cooperation going forward. We are at an unprecedented times, and we are facing biggest humanitarian challenge with 3.4 million lives lost. I will refer to UN Sustainable Goals 3, where
Sudarshan, can you hear me? Because you're freezing from time to time.
access to healthcare and medical technology by 2030 is very, very important. Is it better? Hello?
No, it continues freezing. The images and the sound is not always there.
Is it better now, Roger?
Yes, I think, let's give it a try.
Okay, sorry for my connectivity in India sometime, but in India we move forward whenever the hitches are there. So I was talking of UN Sustainable Goals, where access to technology and health for all is 2030 goal, which is only possible with the help of cooperation and partnership. If you define access, access is function of infrastructure, both physical infrastructure and people infrastructure. That's one part of it. Second is governance mechanism, which is regulatory mechanism and other areas let the medical technology work. Third is the available of technology, and the fourth is affordability. Unless the 4 dimensions work together, access is not possible, and that is fundamental. Whenever we talk of technology, whenever we talk of everything, integrated approach is fundamental. Having said that, there are 4 approaches which are very important. I will give some of the examples from past. First example of access is HIV drugs, which got into Africa. In 2000, the price of HIV drugs was $12,000 annual cost. CIPLA brought it $1 a day, $360 a day. And if you see the impact of penetration of HIV drugs from 2003 to 2009, the penetration went up to $3 to 3% to 36%. Example is that affordability is very, very important. Sometimes if you've got a technology, if you've got physical infrastructure, but if the affordability is not there, it will not make the difference. So first is affordability backed with the infrastructure. Second is, if you see the example of COVID drugs, and there's a lot of examples of voluntary licensing approach which are being followed. And I will congratulate, it gets the balance of intellectual property and it gets the cooperation of all leading companies. Gilead has been a great example of remdesivir. It has given a license to 7 companies in India. And from India, it is also being supplied to 126 countries. And it is an example from 100%, the price has reduced to around 3%. It used to be around $520, now it is $10 to $12. So it gets the accessibility and it gets the availability of the products. Komal also mentioned many of the vaccine manufacturers around the world, they have entered into collaboration. Classic example, AstraZeneca with Serum Institute, Johnson & Johnson with Biological Events, and also the vaccines are developed in India because it is important that capacity and capability is being built up. And we will see a lot of examples of voluntary licensing. In fact, MSD is entering into voluntary licensing with 4 or 5 manufacturers in India. Eli Lilly is entering into voluntary licensing. So it is important during this crisis situation, voluntary licensing becomes very, very important. Third is the concept of regional hubs, which is very important. And I will refer to the conference which are held recently in mid-April by Africa Union. And one of the things which is being talked about, that there are 5 regional hubs, 5 centers will be created in Africa, 3 immediately, Rwanda, South Africa, and Senegal. And it will improve the penetration of vaccines from 1%, which is there at the moment, to around 37, 38%. It is important to create regional capacity because capacity and capability building is very important to go forward. Last point, which I will say, is global fund. It is not important to give fish, it is important to teach fishing, and global fund which harness the capacity and capability around the world and share the technology with other parts of the world. I will stop here and thank you for kind attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sudarshan. This has been a very sort of useful insight in what is the generics industry perspective in terms of collaboration. And perhaps when we get to the discussion round, I would like to invite you to develop a bit further this idea of a global fund, which you have briefly touched upon at the very end, but which I think as it stands merits 1 or 2 additional sentences. With that, I hand over to our last speaker on this panel, Ms. Pascale Boulet. As I said, she's working for Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative. She's heading there the sort of IP department. And I think the DNDi, so for me, has always been a very interesting speaker at this trade and health workshop to actually illustrate how IP can be used as a tool to ensure access to technologies. So Pascale, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you to the WTO for inviting me to share the perspective of the NDI. Can you hear me well?
You can't hear me. Yes, sorry.
I'm trying to go to the next slide. Okay, so for those of you who may not know the DNDi, which stands for the Drug for Neglected Disease Initiative, it was created back in 2003 by public and private health and research institutions. And our mission is to address the needs of neglected patients around the world by creating life-saving medicines and treatments. The reason we were invited to join this debate, I guess, is because we work through partnership. DNDi is a virtual research and development organization, so we don't have any laboratories or premises, and we rather work as a virtual chief of orchestra, if you want. We work with a varieties of partners from the academic and public health research institute to major pharmaceutical companies, but also companies and key stakeholders in low and middle income countries. And so DNDi coordinates different types of projects with all of these partners to drive them through the different discovery, through the different stages of the research and development. And so you can see here that, for example, we have all kinds of projects at different levels in the research and development chain. And our role is really to take those projects from discovery up to translation to clinical development and to implementation. And for each of those projects, the relationship between the NDI and the partners are embedded in various legal agreements. And those agreements are critical to manage the relationship, but also the sharing of intellectual property, the sharing of data and knowledge that is created through the partnership, and most of all, to ensure access to the resulting end products. And as I said in introduction, given that our mission is to address the needs of neglected patients, access is really at the core of any partnership. And so the commitment to access starts at very early stage, at the conception phase of every project, not once a product is in late clinical development or even later when it has received regulatory approval. We start to talk about access, what should be the target price, the maximum price that patient and health system can afford for the necessary treatment. We discuss how we're going to manage intellectual property and to share knowledge and data. And all of those discussions happen very early. So intellectual property is, of course, the only element, but the key element of the collaboration. We cannot move and enter into a collaboration agreement without having agreed on very clear terms about how IP will be managed, how it will be shared, and how to make sure that intellectual property will not impede access to the resulting product or will not impede sharing of research outputs. And this was very much embedded in the NDI IP policy, which was adopted very early after the organization was created, to guide all of our negotiation with all partners. And we have three basic principles in our intellectual property policy, which is to ensure equitable access and affordability of the end product the NDI contributes to develop, to make the result of the NDI research available to the wider research community, and whenever possible, to develop drugs as public goods. So IP ownership and licensing term will, of course, be devised on a case-by-case basis. But the main objective is always to disseminate the result of research and to vastly share data and knowledge. So over the years, we have come to define what we call our gold standard licensing terms, which are essentially the fourth you can see on the screen, where we always negotiate on the basis of non-exclusivity. Because again, our mission is to share as much as possible and to enable as much as possible sharing of technologies and knowledge. We would secure worldwide research and manufacturing rights so that we can, so that the product and the necessary output for the product can maybe manufactured wherever it is needed and with the best possible capabilities. But we would also have a commitment in particular from industrial partners to make the product available at cost plus a minimal margin in all the countries that are affected by neglected diseases. And this would be regardless of the income level of the country, because the population we are targeting are population that have very little purchasing power, and that may be also neglected by health systems. And lastly, we would, as I mentioned, non-exclusivity is really a key principle that the organization has been adopting in all its negotiation. And this is to enable, whenever possible, technology transfer and local production to, when there is need, multiply the sources of production and potentially even decrease the price of product with volumes. Lastly, what I would say is that in case the partnership would come to a conclusion because the partners would have differing priorities or would no longer be interested to work with us, we would always secure the necessary rights and the freedom to operate for the NDI to continue to work on the project. So we would get access to all the necessary IP, all the necessary data, all the necessary knowledge, and access to the technology so that we can continue the project with a different partner if the partner would leave, would stop the collaboration. And I think I will stop here. I have no idea of the time, so I hope I'm still within the time allocated.
Yeah, a bit beyond, but that's no problem, Pascal. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I couldn't see the timer with the slides.
That's the issue when you show slides. But anyway, thank you for your presentation. And I think you made a very important point about the commitment, excuse me, to access being taken into account from the very beginning of any project, which I think is an interesting point to bear in mind. Now, instead of me asking questions, and before perhaps I give the floor to Sudarshan to develop a bit the idea of the Global Fund, we have one question from the floor, which I think touches on an interesting point when it comes to cooperation and tech transfer. I wanted to ask the more general question, are existing mechanisms and tools sufficient to foster the use of technology transfer? But we have a somewhat more targeted question here from the floor saying, how can the global community facilitate the transfer of vaccine and related technologies within the TRIPS framework to developing countries and least developed countries? Would any of the speakers like to respond to these two questions?
Well, happy to take that, Roger.
So ladies first and then Sudarshan. Yes, please.
I think, the TRIPS framework has enabled us to get the vaccines we have today. I think that's a very important point. In fact, I really liked this last note on Trevor's slide that says IP is to deploy knowledge and it's not a barrier. I think that's very important. What the global community could do in the short term is to remove the trade barriers, to dose share. I think these export restrictions and ensuring that restricted supply of raw materials and skilled workers reaches the right place and that safety and quality is maintained. It does help if the regulatory system could also work in tandem. I think that's what we can do right now. From an industry point, Mr. Jain gave you a whole list of collaborations that we're doing. But, honestly, we've had over 300 collaborations. 77% of those are on tech transfer. So that's already taking place. Yes, the question comes that, why not more? It goes to the complexity and the absorption of the technology from the licensee. I think there's a bit of issue there. From a long-term perspective, and I think that's really where LMICs and LDCs can really be useful, is to create that ecosystem, work with all stakeholders, work with industry, work with international organizations, civil society, and governments. And create that. And these 8 principles, the rule of law, the incentive system, the predictability and stability, which I understand can be difficult, but I think those things are critical, because if the innovation system is not sustainable, and if policies are changed overnight or with the change of government, you will not be able to create that sustainable ecosystem. And so it'll only be patchwork that'll happen. And that's not something that's viable. Thank you.
Thank you, Komal. And Sudarshan, your hand is raised. Please.
So I will build on, Roger, I will build on 2 thought processes. One is on the global bank, and second is the point which Komal was talking about. Talking about the global fund, this is the idea which has been propagated by Arvind Panigiria from University of Columbia. Intellectual property is fundamental in the case of life sciences. So what he's saying, that this global fund should buy the technology at the early stage from universities and early startups, build the technology and provide this technology to the places where the capacity exists. So it is important that instead of giving the fish where we give vaccines free around the world, we buy the technology, we build it up and become the partners of distributing technology and building that capability around the world. It is a great idea. It needs to be built up. And I will request if WTO and WHO can take the lead, and Professor Panagria is one of the most respected economists around the world. That is point number one. Point number two, building on what Komal was saying, in India, we have been building on a lot of partnerships, voluntary licensing arrangement as part of TRIPS. It is important that patent waiver alone will not be enough. What will be required is the transfer of technology. But one very important, which Komal also highlighted, that we should ensure that there are no trade barriers. There are no restrictions on supply of inputs, which came in the way of producing vaccines in some part of the world. And there should be also sharing of capability building. Because if capability, if formula, if processes are not transferred, it will not make the difference. And now is the time those kind of partnerships should flourish. It is taking place, and there are a host of examples of that kind. So what we are talking here, Roger, is building the total integrated ecosystem. And COVID has been a catalyst. And there are companies which are playing a fundamental, and we should appreciate the contribution of very many companies. And this seminar of yours should be a catalyst to that process, that it is not only technology, it is the capacity and capability building, which is very, very important. Thank you very much, Roger.
Thank you, Sudarshan. We are late, I know, but any final sort of comments from Trevor or Pascal before we move on?
Maybe just from our side, Roger, from the medical technology side, I mean, you know, access to us is fundamental. If we can't get the technology that we're producing to those who need it, our mission is always incomplete. And I just want to just really reiterate that, you know, whether you agree with us or disagree with us, that we welcome the dialogue. And thanks very much for facilitating it, Roger. We'll find it better together.
Thank you. Pascal?
Maybe,
yes.
yeah, just to a couple of points. First, I think we have to acknowledge the fact that in relation to COVID-19 technologies, as pointed out by Jamie Love in the chat, I think the reason why we have technologies available, and in particular vaccine today, is mostly because of the huge financing that governments have put forward, which is completely unprecedented. And here again, I mean, this is something that you know, as the NDI, we are able to deliver technologies because we are getting financing from public and philanthropic institutions, and this is what is making research and development possible from our perspective. The companies have also have contributed, yes, but I think we shouldn't forget this huge contribution from the public sector, and with this, which is also making critical the role of government in defining the rules of how the knowledge and data and technologies that has been created by this public funding should be shared and made available to ensure equity in access to COVID-19 technologies.
Yes, thank you very much, Pascal. That's indeed an idea which is sort of regularly coming to the table and certainly merits further reflection. So thank you very much to our four panelists on this sort of second session. And I think it's high time to move on to the third panel. I'm very happy for this one to have Padma Shri Gil Sampath speaking to us. She will actually share her research, especially in the area of local production, as well as about sustainable business solutions that are proposed in this regard. And then I understand that her presentation will pretty much focus on Africa. So comments from the other panelists are, of course, most welcome to complete the picture, because especially the industry representatives, you are the ones who will sort of have to contribute to local production, building local production capacities. So your views would, of course, also be very interested to have in this panel. Padma Shri, if you are with us, I hope the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know if you can all see me. I'm going to share screen.
Padma Shri, we can't see you, but you're sharing your desk. Okay, yeah, now you're getting there. So we see your presentation. If you can go into full presentation modus.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. You see the presentation now?
Yes. Now it's perfect. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Oh, this is sorry, this is not the right presentation. Okay, so basically, okay, so I'll begin with giving a sort of a slight background, right? So, I mean, really, there's a lot of talk about production capacity, but I just want to start by sort of like setting the context. So if we take it on a global level, there are clear wide gaps in production capacity today. So, you know, first of all, it's focused in certain regions. And after this sort of rather successful example of India and Bangladesh's pharmaceutical sector, you see actually that there have been difficulties in building production capacity in a large number of other developing countries. And this is not just because there are no conducive policy frameworks available, because if you really go to industrial policy and specific sectoral policies that are aimed at developing pharmaceutical sectors in different countries, you find that a wide range of countries really like Botswana, Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, the list is very, very long. They have programs to promote pharmaceutical manufacturing. And you also see that a large number of other countries like Algeria, Indonesia, and so on, they employ specific incentives in terms of procurement or in terms of technology sharing, tech transfer, or market protection for certain categories of pharmaceutical products to ensure that also local production is somehow incentivized. Now, here what I have is simply to show the range. So the circle doesn't denote the size of the pie, but it rather shows really who is really at the kern of global production, okay, the top 10 global companies, for instance, and what is the sort of like the differences as we go down the capabilities ladder. So the top 10 global companies, they have a total sales of about over $400 billion. This is 2019 figures. In comparison with them, you have top 10 global generic pharma, who have about $50 billion in 2018. Then you can compare that with the top 10 Indian pharmaceutical companies, which had annual revenues between 2 to 4 billion. And then you go down to what's happening in Africa, for instance, where 70 to 90% of the drugs are imported, except for 3 countries, with South Africa, Egypt, and Morocco, where they really produce a lot of local drugs. You see actually that the capacity of the firms to produce and also their revenue, it tapers down quite fast. For instance, Aspen Pharmaceuticals in South Africa, the total sales in 2019 was about 2.6 billion, okay? But Aspen operates in a large number of countries. When you compare that to a very good pharmaceutical firm in Nigeria, say Emzor Pharmaceuticals, the annual revenue in 2019 was just $17.5 million US. And none of the companies in Ethiopia have a revenue of $30 million. So just to give you an idea. Now, when we talk about local production, this is not the first time we are talking about local production. The interest in local production sort of fades and then comes back every time we have sort of a global crisis, more or less, right? And here in this slide, I've sort of captured the benefits and the sticky points in local production. So benefits are standard. You create skilled jobs. It's part of your wider economic development strategy. Local firms respond more quickly to demands. And there are advantages of continuous manufacturing, which simply means that you can produce more than in batches and you can be more resilient in production cycles. You can innovate. The sticky points remain the same. And these are the sticky points that are often mentioned. And I think we've heard some of them also in the previous presentations. One is that, you know, local companies from low and middle income countries that are just starting off, they have difficulties in achieving economies of scale. And this makes local production less efficient. So it increases costs, right, which are passed on to the user or the consumer. And here comes in this standard trade-off between, you know, you can have industrial policy, but if it doesn't promote access to medicines, then you're affecting health policy objectives. And then another objection normally is that drug quality is hard to achieve, right? Now, when you take a look at that though, and then you see what have countries really done, then in building local production, then you somehow stumble upon the classical model, which is what I call it here, which is what was used by India and then later by Bangladesh, which had relatively similar policy trajectories when they talk about building capacity, right? So if you go to a lot of these case studies of India's and Bangladesh's pharmaceutical sector, some of which I've also done, the popular storytelling points is that they had state-owned enterprises. And these state-owned enterprises were very important in promoting production capacity. There was a lot of public research support, and intellectual property space was created in the Indian case by the patent law of 1970, but in Bangladesh's case as well, by sort of limiting the market for local firms when they were able to produce certain drugs. Some of the things we sort of miss out or just gloss over when we talk about this is that there are additional important levers, right? The additional important levers is the role played by R&D subsidies, grants to firms, joint grants, and export incentives given to firms to export to other parts of the world. Another important lever is really sort of consistency of policy framework and continuity of providing certain incentives for the pharmaceutical sector, keeping pharmaceutical production as a priority sector, making sure that you not only have some large firms, but that some capacity that you build in 1 or 2 or 3 firms, that these sort of spill over on a sectoral basis to medium-sized firms, and then this is also taken up to expand the sector. This is very important to move from 1 or 2 success stories to really build a sector that can produce. Then another important lever is the establishment of common industry structure, like testing capacity, common active pharmaceutical ingredient parks for pharmaceutical drugs, biotech parks, regional or national bioequivalence capabilities. And then comes a key thing, the role of markets and market access, especially when firms are sort of in the initial stages of learning and building production capacity. They really need access to markets. So in the case of India, and then in the case of Bangladesh, a thing that really worked for the local firms is access to domestic market. Because if you know that you're going to produce products and you're going to be able to sell them in your local market, this is a very important incentive to invest. And then technology. Another thing that's important in India, for instance, is that technology transfer was somehow routed in the beginning through actually public research institutes, right? So firms could start to learn. And there was also technology spillovers because scientists who worked in these state-owned enterprises, they then went on to start their own firms. Now, what happens if you move away from these classic models to other places, right? So simply from a business perspective, what you're talking about for local production is that you want large-scale investments, you want local firms to overcome the capital costs associated with setting up this capacity, so initial investment, and then you want them to invest continuously in continuing their operations, so you want to get working capital. So a working local production pharmaceutical facility, you need actually a plant, you need access to all raw materials, you need competitive labor to manufacture, and you need a scale large enough to recover the initial costs. And when you're able to do that, you can price competitively and increase access to medicines at the break-even business level. In practice, what happens is that these large-scale investments into plants and facilities rely on the ability of firms to source basic resources, physical infrastructure like electricity, water, transport. They need know-how into construction planning and design. They need to import equipment and utilities, especially for good manufacturing practice. They need to source the ingredient, which translates into supply chain problems. They need skilled labor, which translates into really your education system. They need to be competitive, which means that they need enough labor of all kinds, including marketing, distribution, legal. And they need scale, which is not just about establishing a plant. It really depends on markets, which they can supply their products to. So if you take it in terms of making initial investments to achieving economies of scale, normally, firms need about, say, 0 to 8 years based on even, I've interviewed and worked with firms on different continents. And here they have different kinds of risks, right? They have risks from establishing production facilities, backing up financing, establishing reputation, you know, the reaching distribution channels, ease of domestic supply chains, and so on and so forth, right? And at each of these stages in a low-income country, you have different kinds of additional risks that materialize, which you cannot foresee in a business plan. You can have system infrastructure risks because of lack of physical infrastructure. You can have industrial risks because it's difficult to have licenses or source intermediate goods or have, you know, technological know-how. You can have sector-specific risks because procurement is mainly governmental or dictated by donor agencies. You don't have access to fragmented markets. Or you can have political risks because you have a sudden change in incentives or policy direction. And this is something, you know, it's where firms falter. So if you take the top column from where they make initial investments, right, they can falter and terminate the project at any stage. Some of them terminate the project already when they set up production because they are not able to access public distribution channels or private distribution channels. Some of them expand production to introduce different products, but they are not able to recover working capital to maintain those lines and to technologically upgrade. And that's why you see a large number of firms in developing countries that just produce a few drugs and do not technologically scale up, right? And in the post-COVID context, to see how you can alleviate these concerns is really important because there's increased threats to health. There are a range of possibilities to allow firms to thrive because you want them to thrive, and because there's a wider policy alignment, not only in Africa, but also in the wider world, that you need greater production capacity, right? Take the case of vaccines, for instance, okay? In the case of vaccines outside of India right now, there is capacity in countries like Bangladesh, Indonesia, and South Korea. But vaccine markets are concentrated and there are large capacity barriers. And this I'm saying because I just conducted a sort of local production capacity overview survey of large number of firms in Africa and Asia. One of the capacity barriers is biosafety level 3 production and certification. Another one is really simply production capacity. For instance, if you take BioVac Institute in South Africa, it has the capacity to produce 10 million filling lines per annum when compared, say, with Serum Institute of India, which is producing about 80 million COVID-19 doses per month. And BioVac's capacity is its total capacity, right? Then you have other institutes, for instance, in Africa. This is a slide that was basically discussed at the African Union Summit and presented by actually the director of the Africa CDC. And many of these firms, they have actually capacity issues, which means they need to scale up capacity, basically. You see the same kind of issues when you talk about COVID-19 therapeutics, right? Now, some of these are very difficult to manufacture, especially if they are actually biological treatments. But there are many others that actually can be manufactured. And there are countries in Africa, as well as other countries in Asia, like including Bangladesh, that can actually manufacture this, and they possess the technologies for it, right? So viable business models. What are the viable business models for both pharmaceutical production and vaccine production in a post-COVID-19 world? I would say off the top of my head, 3 primary models exist, talking to these firms and understanding what is really stopping production capacity. So the first one is really to sort of like augment production capacity to leverage additional lines of production. So there are firms that have the technology that can get licenses, that can produce more. So what you really need to do is to increase their capacity to produce, expand those lines, and actually probably help them to expand into COVID-19 products. The second model would be to leverage what I would say adjacent capacity. By that, I mean really that there are firms that can do fill and finish and packaging. What you want to do maybe is to see how you can increase the forward linkages in these firms to help them to move into really manufacturing and production of both drugs and vaccines. Because this could be really important to maintain actually regional and national pharmaceutical security, not just now, but for the future. A third model is really to try and think of setting up new production capacities. Now, all of these primary models that I'm talking about, they're really useful to consider even within the African Union Summit's outcomes, which is to set up these 5 production hubs, because different areas in the developing world have different kinds of capacity. And each of these models has different risk timelines and considerations. But if we start now, I think that we can really move towards building that kind of capacity, in a sequential fashion. The R&D, technology, and know-how, of course, is essential to this. It needs to come together with the investment in finance. I have a last slide. Do I have time for it?
Sorry. Yes, please go ahead. I think that makes sense.
Yeah. So the questions for me really to move ahead with these 3 models, they relate not just to what to finance and how to finance, but rather really sort of how should this work, okay? The first question to answer is, why should the firms in developing countries bear the risks associated with system infrastructure or sector risks or political risks, okay? And in the political risk, you can add the risks of, for instance, uncertainty about the TRIPS waiver, the discussion on technology transfer that we are having. These are risks for these firms. Why should these firms bear it? That's not really fair. Okay, and so you need to guard these firms against this and set up a technology ecosystem, which is, according to me, not just about absorption capacity, it's much wider than that. And it's also much wider than just providing classical industrial incentives here and there, but it really calls for targeted support to alleviate the problems to the supply chains creation for these firms, to provide industry infrastructure and R&D infrastructure, and then to fast track regulatory approvals, right? Then finance for these firms is not just about providing finance. It's not just about giving a loan or making sure that they get started, but it's about the right business model in which to provide finance. So it's closely linked to operating costs, but also to breaking even. And how can firms break even to move through those 4 steps that I outlined, to have technological and industrial upgrading, to expand production baskets, and to expand and to survive, right? So the question is really about returns. And those returns won't come unless these firms have some sort of market access in all ways possible. So we have to start thinking about, yes, we need to create supply for production of vaccines and drugs, but these firms also need access to markets in all ways possible, through procurement, through possibly directly accessing markets, and through probably bidding processes to international agencies. So, and then they need direct support to build quality and image. We need to make real money available for different stages of production, for R&D and for upgrading, which we're not doing right now. We're talking in pockets. We're talking about selecting a few things. But I think that, we don't have a sort of a consideration of what it takes in a pipeline and what we need to make available. And we need really more technological know-how, because there are manufacturing practices, there are trade secrets, and these are really important for these firms to understand how to produce and how to produce quality products and how to maintain quality over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Padma, for your very sort of comprehensive presentation. And I think that gave us a very good idea of the many challenges which are out there in terms of building local or regional production. Maybe, yes, I should start my video, sorry. So here we are. So maybe the one question which I have, and then I will hand over to other panelists if they want to comment on your presentation. You briefly touched on one of your slides on also the need to build sort of R&D capacities, because I think much of the discussion, and you know this from your very sort of distant past at UNCTAD, when we discussed local production, I think it was almost always about sort of manufacturing, but not so much about research and development. So the question I would have is, I mean, should the efforts we are now making, should they also comprise R&D sort of activities? And should this be a sort of rather mid to long-term objectives, or how would you situate them time-wise?
Thanks, Roger. That's a really interesting topic, actually, I think. So I would see it like this. I think that firms are at different stages of production capacity. If you take it across Asia and Africa, which can actually step in to sort of like augment production of drugs, vaccines, and other products. So at the top level, you have what I would say are sort of the new Indian firms, right? The new substitute Indian firms. So what Indian firms were able to do at the end of the 1990s and the 2000s, okay? We need a new set of firms coming in to do that. And why do I say that? Because from an economic perspective, it's important to diversify the supply pool. And it also brings in a lot of sort of like interesting dynamics between old suppliers, new suppliers. We're trying to bring in fresh blood. And to do that, you can probably really focus on a little bit of augmenting of manufacturing capacity, a little bit of targeted R&D capacity, and so on. But really to make them move from traditional vaccine platforms or traditional drugs to biologics and say mRNA and the new vaccine platforms that we're talking about, we also need to augment the R&D capacity. And this might not happen today, tomorrow, it might not even happen in 1 or 2 years, but making this leap now and using this opportunity to targetedly do certain things in some parts of the world, it will actually open up the possibility for different kinds of innovation to come into the market in about 3 to 5 to 7 to 9 years. And I think this is very important. And here I'm sort of very skeptical of choosing certain firms and working with them. I think it's more important to create a dynamic innovation environment. So the R&D investments can help to create that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. That's very helpful. I was going to turn to Sudarshan, but you've raised your hand, so I don't even have to do this. So please share your comments with us.
Very much, Roger, and thank you, Padma Shri, for an excellent presentation. I'd like to add 2 comments here that even if I have production technology and capacity built up, but unless I have got the advantage of physical infrastructure in terms of cool chain, in terms of transportation, in terms of skilled manpower, which can inject and make it work, it won't work for the access of technology. So what we are seeing in India and other parts of the world is, yes, we have got technology production capacity built up, but healthcare infrastructure in terms of nurses, paramedical people, doctors is very, very important. And that softer part. So we have to work in both the ways. One is creating production capacity, and second is creating trained manpower over the years, which become fundamental going forward to improve the access. And Roger, I would like to emphasize once again that building that softer infrastructure is very important. I will give the example, like say we have got 10% wastage of vaccine administration in the country because of the wrong storage and administration. So this part again is equally important going forward. I will stop here. Thank you very much, Roger.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And would you like to react to this, Padma?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in the end, everything becomes important, right? Like Sudarshan is right, that when we actually sort of like build production capacity, it's just not enough to have drugs. We need to have the expertise to administer it correctly. We need to have healthcare facilities where we can offer proper preventative care, diagnosis and treatment and so on. But let's not, I mean, one thing I have to say though is that when we shouldn't sort of like use that to say we can't build production capacity today, because these are things that don't happen in different in low resource contexts and low institution contexts, like where all developing countries come from. These things don't happen in a day. These are changes that take time, and they happen over time. So I think to build on certain momentum, to start building production capacity, and then to see how we can use that to increase access to healthcare could be a really good way to segue into trying to get a whole health system working.
Thank you very much. I should actually take up a comment which came already up in the previous session, and that is a reference to Article 66.2 of the TRIPS agreement, which, as you know, is the requirement to provide incentives to transfer technology on behalf of developed countries. And I think there's a question out there, what is actually happening in that context. And I have actually colleagues in this room who are much better placed to talk to this. But from our experience and taking from the reporting we receive from developed countries, there's actually a lot going on in terms of technology transfer projects, which are put in place by developed countries in the sector of health in particular. It's one of the highest rankings, if I'm not mistaken. And if, again, Bassam is sitting on the other side here, I think there's some 165 projects or so we have identified in the course of last year's reports. So something is going on in this particular area based on 66.2 of the TRIPS agreement. But maybe you wish to take this comment up and say something about this, Padma.
Yeah, sure. So one thing I find when I work in the field with the firms, right, is that what they really need is basically the capacity to move from what I would say lab to the market, which is really that when they have certain technologies, okay, how do they use those technologies to create marketable products? Because there is a difference between scientific research and being available to reconstruct something, but then being able to make a product that works, that sustains itself, and then to really bring it to market requires different kinds of skills, right? So I think that when we talk about technology transfer, not just in the health sector, but across sectors, we really actually need to focus on this spectrum of different kinds of capabilities that firms need. This is not just because of the firms in the pharma sector. If you take what happened in the case of industrial experiences of South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, China now, and other countries, this is what really needs. We need to move products from the lab to the market, and that's where core bottlenecks are in those sort of like competencies in a large number of firms and institutes in the developing world.
Thank you very much. Sudarshan, is your hand still up?
It is a very important aspect, 66.2 of the agreement. And it is what we need to do is amplify some of the initiatives which have been taken by some of the companies to share technology across the world, because that promotes the transfer of technology. So those efforts, those best practices have to be amplified. So it becomes part of spreading the culture of sharing technology in these difficult times. So I will say that is an important part of this agreement, and we have to amplify and we have to spread the advantages and some of the best practices which are there in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you for this comment. If I may add one question, because we may have one speaker less on the last panel, so I do use this opportunity to ask one question, which is actually bridging the gap between the different industry sectors. And the question is Padma, is there any difference when it comes to building manufacturing capacities for medical devices as compared to the pharmaceutical industry? Is it exactly the same story when we look at the challenges, the benefits, and so on?
Well, I mean, some of the competencies are different, right? Because when we talk about medical devices, we're really talking about precision technology. We're talking about really technology which is sort of like a very engineering oriented and based, which is then combining it with medical knowledge. So you really need actually much more skills and capabilities to do diagnostics and medical devices, and then actually to produce drugs, which, I mean, if from my perspective, it's easier for firms to formulate drugs by importing APIs. It's something they can easily master and then try to move backwards along the value chain. It then comes actually difficulties in diagnostics, in sort of like then vaccines. They become much more complex, right? They become more difficult for firms to move beyond fill and finish in vaccines to really producing antigens and to combining the vaccine on their own with adjuvants and stabilizers, or in the case of diagnostics, it gets harder actually. That said, I have to say that, because we talk so much about the technology ecosystem, right? So some of this basic infrastructure that you need to build these competencies, they are similar across the board, right? So when you really sort of have some skills, you have good physical infrastructure and so on, it helps to sort of like, ramp up ability for firms to experiment and to see if they can have forward and backward linkages within the country or in that region. And I think that that's really important. So for countries that manage to go to medical devices sectors, also for instance, in India, when I studied medical devices in the past, you see that actually those kinds of things, they really matter.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Any final comments from our colleagues before we move to the last panel? That doesn't seem to be the case. So thank you so much, Padma, for sharing all these insights with us, which I think would merit a seminar on its own to have a proper discussion. But I think many useful thoughts, which certainly we will sort of take up in our future work. So with that, I will move to the last and final panel now. This will be an opportunity for Irene Kitsara, and I apologize again, Didier Mubangizi, who's from WHO, and Daryong Yu, to provide us with information on their respective work at WIPO, WHO, and WTO regarding empirical foundations for effective and informed decision-making in support of access to medical technologies. Irene, would you like to go first and provide us with insights about your work on patent landscapes?
Sure, Roger, and thank you very much for the invite, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to all the participants. Share the screen. So we heard before about medical technologies, and we heard from Trevor about a wide range of different technologies that are encompassed under the umbrella of medical technologies. Equally diverse and broad is also the innovation that is happening, the enabling technologies which play a role for the core medical technologies. And there are a series of different reasons why it does matter to track innovation and in these areas and support different decisions that are linked to either R&D investment, prioritization, like management, business strategy, technology transfer, procurement and trade, collaborations, and in more general terms, policy making. Now, when we talk about patents. Patents are a recognized indicator of output of science and technology and innovation trends. And the patent documents, beyond being used as a means of patent protection, they are also a very valuable source of technical, legal, and business data that we can really use to learn, to create a lot of knowledge and taking fast decisions. Patents are complementary to non-patent data, mainly thinking about scientific literature, and to some extent they are also unique. Some information which is filed as patent application will not necessarily be available in the scientific literature. WIPO has worked in the fields of patent analytics, so analyzing the different fields of patent documents and trying to contribute to different and support different decision-making and different stakeholders in the innovation ecosystem. We have started with a series of patent landscape reports, which started as a development agenda project and are now a regular product of WIPO. We have produced some which are directly linked to medical technologies, including topics such as antiretrovirals, selected neglected diseases, or vaccines, while others, while not directly linked to medical technologies, do have an implication on that, such as accelerator technologies with impact on cancer treatment. A report we did on artificial intelligence and AI-powered diagnostics, or for instance, which can reach out to broader range of end users thanks to the software applications, or for instance, computational chemistry, which can accelerate product development. We provide these reports in PDFs. We share the patent search strategies for whoever wishes to also do the same in different databases, but we also share the data sets with links to the related patent documents. We have also established a new series of publication called the Wider Technology Trends, where we have enriched patent data and related information and analysis with non-patent data. So we have tried to see how much innovation happens, for instance, on the side, or activity happens on the side of scientific literature. We wanted also to take a step back and see the bigger picture, seeing, for instance, mergers and acquisitions as a differentiation in the strategy of different patent applicants and companies. And we also looked at, for instance, litigation data. We also wanted, as technology does not exist in a vacuum, and we talked about the whole ecosystem, we also include information about the wider context, such as standards, regulation, policy, and legislation. We also include different stakeholders' perspective and inputs in form of comments. The second issue of this series is about assistive technology. It's something we developed in close cooperation with the WHO Global Cooperation on Assistive Technology, GATE. We have started now providing interactive dashboards where member states and different stakeholders can drill into the results. They can look at patent protection of their jurisdiction, or they can look at the origin of innovation from their country, drill into the specific subcategories of technology they're interested interests. For whatever purposes they wish to have. And we talked about this journey from the patent application to the market. And so we introduced also the technology readiness level assessment of the emerging assistive technologies to identify how far are they to being commercialized. And we provided an interactive visualization for that. We saw, for instance, that for emerging assistive technologies, only 18% of them are fully commercialized. And what we saw was we also identified a series of factors which can play a role for either accelerating or making it more lengthy, making it to the end market. Again, we did this for the purpose of having a broader context and understanding of the whole picture, rather than trying to approach it in an exhaustive way. Now, why does it matter? Why we believe very much into what was mentioned before, the access to the information and the dissemination of related information. We want to create or contribute to a knowledge base to support policy decision making. We hope that with this kind of products, we can shed light on the state of the art in given technologies, to clarify some misconceptions which are maybe just based on reputation, on some rumors or some other sources of information. Provide the IP perspective, which is not always the case even when technologies are being discussed. Provide information on geographical coverage of patent protection, with some technologies which may lie in the public domain, and to some extent also provide a first step before a freedom to operate analysis and public procurement. We also hope that this information can also help different stakeholders assess their competitive advantage, either of the jurisdiction or region or specific players. We also want to help identify existing or potential markets in given technologies and cooperation partners. There are, of course, some caveats. Patent analytics can be very powerful, but we have to be very careful what kind of questions do we pose, because based on that we will have the related answers. Also, it is important to be aware about the availability of data, which is not always the case to a full extent. We should be aware of differences across jurisdiction, what is concerned about patentable subject matter, backlogs, incentive to file patents, examination versus registration processes, the differences across cultures. So we should always bear in mind that patenting is just an indicator of innovation. And it's not just exhaustive truth. And there may be also differences in filing strategies and practices across either different areas of technologies or different applicant profiles. We should also be very careful to be aware of that we look at the real picture of who is leading, bearing in mind the different corporate trees, the mergers and acquisitions, affiliations to individuals to companies. So we hope that we can support with the provision of this factual evidence to the different discussions and facilitate the discussions leading towards support of access to medical technologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Irene, for this overview of the many things you are indeed doing in this particular area, and which I think helps getting a better idea, as you say, about the broader picture in terms of, the patenting of technologies, including in the pharmaceutical sector. I think you have sort of answered a question which I had in my mind, about the usefulness of patent landscape reports, given that they are static in time and only represent a certain image at a given point in time. But then, as you rightly sort of pointed out, it could be, for example, sort of more for political reasons to get a sort of an idea of what is out there. But it could also be a first step towards freedom to operate analysis. And maybe you could just elaborate a bit on this, because I think this is maybe not known to everybody. And what is actually the difference between patent landscape reports, which are not legal status reports, and then freedom to operate, which are more moving in this direction. So that I think would be helpful for those operating on the ground as well.
Sure. So the patent landscape report, as you rightfully mentioned, it is providing a snapshot of what is happening. So what is most interesting is to capture within the scope the different types of technologies, but it is not. It is tolerated to have certain what we call noise. So not to capture all relevant documents. If statistically it will not have an impact. We are also talking about hundreds to thousands of patent documents when we're doing a patent landscaping study. But at the same time, when we're looking at the freedom to operate exercise, we're not just interested about what are the general trends. We're interested about whether one specific patent document may be critical for instance, not allowing a product to enter into a market. So there we typically look at a very limited number of patent documents which are very close to what we are looking for. And there we do an analysis of the patent claims in a very detailed manner. So the purpose of the exercise in one and the other case is completely different. And a patent landscape can be, for instance, in the case of antiretrovirals, the study we did with the medicines patent pool, we provided this first instance of information, and that helped them identify which were these specific documents that then they wanted to look at the legal status. And the legal status is also something that changes from one day to the next. So this is also timely, very, very critical to look at.
Okay, thank you very much. So I suggest, because I should leave the questions to the end, so I suggest that we now move to our next speaker who has joined us now. And so we have Mr. Mubangizi, who is the head of WHO pre-qualification. And I think you have not heard some of the comments earlier in this webinar, but I think there's a lot of interest in regulatory issues and streamlining of regulation. So to the extent that you can cover this, we would be very much interested to hear this, and of course, any sort of details, the evidence you have about WHO pre-qualification. So thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rogers. And first of all, I will not have any slides. I was alerted a little bit late, and I've been jumping between meetings, and meetings have not been able to prepare slides. But nevertheless, I'm happy to make a contribution to this discussion. First of all, for those who would like to know about pre-qualification, pre-qualification is a UN program that is implemented by WHO to evaluate products for quality, safety, and efficacy primarily for international procurement, but of course for use by member states. And you would say, first of all, let me make a disclaimer that pre-qualification, WHO pre-qualification is not a world regulator. We do this with and on behalf of and for the countries. And the outputs of pre-qualification are then taken on by the user, by the countries to facilitate their decisions. Now, just a quick background, WHO classifies regulatory authorities of countries in 4 categories, maturity levels 1 to 4, 1 being the weakest and 4 being the highest. And under that classification, maturity level 3 is considered to be a stable and mature regulatory authority that is able to assure their citizens of quality, safe and efficacious medicines. And when you look at the current statistics, 70% of the countries, or 141 countries, do not have a national regulatory authority for medicines at the maturity level 3. That means only 27 countries or 53 countries are able to assure their countries constantly that the products that they access are of good quality. And therefore, in the meantime, we know that it's the aspiration of all countries and definitely World Health Organization that all should have access, health for all should have access to quality, safe and efficacious medicines. To do that, this requires information. Information to prove that the products that are being available to these countries are effective. They do what they claim to do. It's not just claims, but they are supported by information. And this information comes from trials, comes from research, comes from studies that are done either in the academic environment or in the research organizations. And it's important that this information is available to regulators, because a regulator is like an arbiter between the producer of the product or the researcher and the recipient. And you know, the balance of information is very lopsided in this respect. The manufacturer knows all the medicine, the information about their products and the researcher, but it's going to be taken by a patient who has least information. And so the person who's going to bear the most impact of these medicines taken has the least information. So it's important that someone in between is like an independent arbiter, and this person to make a plausible decision, a logical decision, a scientific-based decision, need to have access to information. So it is important that the regulators have access to information to be able to make such a decision. So for regulators, including, although we call ourselves pseudo-regulators, because in the true legal sense, we are not regulators, but we do everything a regulator does. We receive information from research settings and from the manufacturer and evaluate it and provide it, make decisions. So it's important that transparency across this chain is maintained. That means the researchers and the manufacturers must be transparent to us, regulators, so that we make informed decisions. But then the consumers and the decision makers at the international procurers, the national regulatory authority, must also be sure of the basis of our decision making. So we must also put out there information that on which we base our decision. So that is the importance of access to information, the importance of transparency, and the importance of sharing information. But of course, for that transparency to happen, there must be mutual trust, but also there must be that fairness, that again, there's not undue compromise of the investment and of the knowledge acquired by people to take advantage of it. I'm going to illustrate this with the current pandemic you are in, and you see the most important point here. We in the COVID pandemic, we have developed, all the world has developed vaccines very quickly, a short time. And these vaccines, as people are dying, these vaccines need to be accessible to every country in the world. No manufacturer, big or small, has the capacity to immediately submit this dossier or this information to all these countries and respond to questions from 194 countries of the members. So what we did, we put a global assessment process that I lead under the pre-qualification. And first we signed confidentiality agreements with the manufacturers. And then we requested the manufacturers to allow us, first of all, to bring in assessors from all the countries, but also to allow us to share this information under confidentiality agreement with all the countries, so that instead of them, so that those countries can rely on our assessment in the pre-qualification program and authorize that information. The flexibility of manufacturers to allow us to share confidential information submitted to us, to the countries, has enabled quick decision-making and access. And I want to end with one statistic. Within 15 days of us listing a vaccine, 101 countries made a decision after receiving our report, made a decision to authorize the use of that vaccine in their country. And that could not have happened anywhere under any system. And that is the tool, the power of sharing information in a transparent manner. And that has enabled people to access safe, effective, and good quality vaccines. And that is very critical for global public health. And we look forward to that cooperation across the value chain, so that then we can be able to make decisions to protect and promote health across the world. Over to you, Chair.
Thank you so much. And I think you did actually respond to one of the questions I wanted to ask you in terms of evidence, of the impact of WHO pre-qualification on the import of vaccines in particular. I think you did provide a response, and it's quite impressive, that more than 100 countries actually did authorize after pre-qualification from WHO. So that's one of the questions I had. If I may, just one other question: is there anything out there? You insisted very much on and rightly so, on the importance of transparency. Are there any best practices, or is there any evidence you can share with respect to the implementation of transparency and also the sharing of data more generally among regulators? Is that, something which is well in place, or is there sort of more to be done?
Thank you very much for this important question. And it's something that I'm passionate about, and to be on record. In 2014, in Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil, there was an international conference of drug regulatory authorities that happened. And I did table a motion at that currently the default is that to exchange information between regulators, you must sign confidentiality agreements. Now, the regulators are not going to gain any commercial benefit out of that information. And I tabled a motion that to change the paradigm, that the default between regulators should be sharing information as long as between regulators to enable them to make the decision such that then they can make quick decisions based on an informed decision. So, in response to your question, there's more work to be done, and I call upon everybody to work towards this paradigm. I feel hurt at one point where I don't remember whether it was around the same time where we got a counterfeit product and that emanated from one of the countries, and we investigated that and informed the responsible regulatory authority. But because of this confidentiality agreement, this information was not shared worldwide. Just 3 months down the line, across another continent, 49 people died because of taking the same product contaminated with a counterfeit product. If this information had been shared worldwide, lives would have been protected. So there is increased sharing of information, for example, among regulators under the WHO facilitated by WHO, the International Conference of Medicines Regulatory Authorities, ICMRA, but I think more needs to be done. But as progress has been made, we should not relax, more needs to be done. But I'm encouraged by the trend. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And with that, because we're already at 3:30, so I would now like to hand the floor over to our colleague from WTO, Dayong Yu. And he will, as I mentioned at the very beginning, he will talk to data about trade flows in medical products, the challenges we face in order to collect those data, and a couple of other things. So Dayong, thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roger. It's my great pleasure to have this opportunity to speak about our work, which is a little bit different than the other speakers. But I think this is a good opportunity to bring the data perspective in the discussion. My talk is basically 3 parts. I will briefly share our work in the past year in mirroring trade in medical and medical technology goods trade. And second, identify some difficulties and challenges we faced and the lessons we learned. And so thirdly, I think I would propose some ideas for consideration by the countries and members and the great health community. Let me start with our experience in the past year in dealing with data. I work in a team dealing with trade statistics. In March last year, immediately after the outbreak of the pandemic, we start working on trade data of medical and medical goods, including the essential supplies on medical PPEs or essential products. We issue our first report on medical goods trade on the 4th April 2020. And we are working on the 3rd revision of that report. The report gave an overview of the trade in medical goods, including medicine, medical supply, medical equipment, and PPEs. According to the data, the global trade of medical goods in 2020 was about $2.3 trillion, account for 7.6% of total world trade in goods. Trade in medical goods grew by 16% in 2020, even when the total world merchandise trade declined by 7.6%. So this is not a surprising figure, but it's quite impressive compared with the trade development in other areas. The origin of export are highly concentrated in a few countries, with export from the top 10 and together account for 2/3 of the world total exports. Unsurprisingly, we see the rapid growth in some critical goods for fighting COVID, such as face masks, test kits, ventilators, in the past year. So basically those goods achieved a 30% growth in the last year. The tariff on medical goods are relatively low. It is 4.8% for all medical goods in general. But for more sophisticated products, or products include more medical technology, it's even lower. So it's 2.1% for medicine, 3.5% for medical equipment. Like Mr. Gan said earlier, that ITA2 really contribute to the trade of high technology-based medical equipment. Our report has been used by members and used by WTO committees in monitoring the trade development and trade measures, including export restrictions. You can find those reports in WTO website if you're interested. Second, the difficulties. In the process of compiling those data, we feel two important things. I think this should be considered by the trade community, also health community. The first is we don't have very good trade flow data on very specific medical products. So that's the the trade flow is recorded based on harmonized system, which is maintained by the World Customs Organization. And there are 5,000 product categories. And basically 5,000 product category covers all trade in goods. So it's very likely one IHS category covers more than many products. So this is particularly true for the medical goods. For example, face masks are classified under a category together with many other unspecified textile products. And the PCR test kit are classified together with all other diagnostic reagents. And then medicines only have 12 tariff lines. So we don't really have very granular data to track the development of specific products. The second difficulty is we have a disconnection between trade and industry data. So if you want to do a supply chain mapping, if we don't have the production data, it will be very difficult. I think this is the reason is not much production data at product level is available because those are private data. So basically those are the two difficulties we faced in the process. And finally, I think I just share a few points. I think that could be the idea that from our perspective, important to be considered. First, I think the governments need to make a good collection of granular, frequent, high-quality data from for trade data, for production data, and for supply use data, which will be important for the supply chain analysis. Second, the international cooperation between the countries should be strengthened. I think from the crisis, we know no country can produce everything they need in the pandemic. So every country need to know exactly what they want and where they can get those products. I think the only way to do that is to establish a reliable international information network. And third, I think international organizations should play a role to facilitate data sharing by create standards, recommendations, and recommend common methodologies to share the data, to improve the data quality. Last but not least, I think the private-public partnership should be strengthened and in producing and sharing data. This is a very important because the difficulty that we face is hard to be solved by not only public, but also private sector. This is obviously very difficult task because most of the industry data or private data is private, it's sensitive. But there's technical and regulatory obstacle need to be tackled. But I think the experience in the past, you see many public-private partnerships have been successfully established in other areas to share the data, to produce useful insights. And there's a lot of good examples to follow. The key, I think, is to build trust between stakeholders, including between the government and businesses. I think with the collective efforts from the health and trade community, we can have a better system to dealing with data issue in the near future. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dayong, for this, again, very comprehensive presentation, and also for making some of the points about the common methodologies to share data, which, I mean, in the three presentations we've heard in this last panel, I think there's a common thread there, which is transparency, and in a way, from different angles, of course, but pulls these things together. I would like to open the floor to any questions that either participants or other panelists have to our three last speakers. Because there's, if I may sort of come in and fill the gap here, there's of course a question I sort of was expecting, perhaps as to the extent our first panel speakers are still with us. Is there sort of information you could share about what are the knowledge gaps you are facing as of governments? What kind of empirical foundations for effective decision making sort of is needed in addition to what we already have? And who could do this? Is Ambassador De Boer, is that something which sort of is turning in your mind, if I may put this question to you and then bring it back to the three panelists? So he doesn't seem to be there. Yeah, sorry. Sorry.
I am here. It's just taking me a while to find my my unmute button.
Yes.
Look, there's a lot of information that we think is that we're still waiting for, and I think this speaks to the value. Well, first of all, this speaks to the value of what it is that we've been talking about this afternoon, which has been very, very interesting, and it's been quite a thorough tour of the waterfront. I would say two things. The one is we need to be talking to all of the actors. This is the benefit of the DG's third way. Talking to all of the actors, that includes industry, that includes the international financial institutions, it includes other international institutions such as the World Health Organization, to create to identify the information gaps and then apply solutions that actually begin to identify those gaps. I continue to be I continue to be disappointed in these discussions from time to time on how parties talk past each other, how members' positions in the WTO are mischaracterized, and which is not particularly helpful in terms of moving forward, and how some members at the WTO don't wish to take a holistic approach to to the pandemic and to health crises, and they prefer to pick a particular lane, a particular agreement. A very good example is some members who say, well, the only route or the only role for the WTO is to talk about IP, because that's the only thing that the WTO does and has jurisdiction over, which of course is quite ridiculous. Absolutely does have a critical role to play with respect to intellectual property, but it has a role for all kinds of other things that touch upon the pandemic. And so not only do I think that there is an information gap and we need to continue talking, but we also need to be talking to each other about holistic approaches to resolution of some of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I see, Jamie, your hand is up.
Thank you. A lot of things that have come up in the pandemic have to do with whether or not countries will essentially do things to address a need for, I guess you could say, a more public goods approach as opposed to a private goods approach. One of the early failures, I thought, in the pandemic was, despite the tens of billions of dollars that went in from governments to the development of vaccines and therapeutics, that some of the contracts were not as designed to give the public that was paying for the development of vaccines a sufficient number of rights as far as sharing either the know-how, access to the cell lines, or the rights and inventions and data. If you look at the WTO, it's primarily an agreement about private goods. The TRIPS agreement is about the rights that are associated with the privatization of R&D, for example, and other types of, making them private goods. And the agreements on services and the agreements on tariffs, everything about the WTO is essentially to improve the efficiency of the markets for private goods. But public goods in this pandemic are really, really important, and there's an undersupply of public goods. So we have advocated that the WTO consider the construction of a new agreement on the supply of public goods, one that's modeled in some ways after the services agreement, so that there can be a system of making voluntary offers to supply public goods to address issues such as the pandemic or technology transfer, other things that people think are important. And even though the agreements are, the offers are made on a voluntary basis, like in the services, they become binding upon listing on a schedule. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Any other request for the floor? Yes, Irene, I see your hand up.
Yes, so I just wanted to talk about gaps which exist in what we are observing at our end when we carry out this patent analytics. So a great issue is the availability of data. So we have different databases, but of course the primary source of information comes from the primary sources. And so making sure that we have information which is representing all countries, all jurisdictions, to talk about what happens with innovation. Also, to some extent, some delays may not in publication of some of these results may not present to us, the full picture. So to some extent, we always have to have this kind of caveats. Then, in terms of trying to link them patent data with other type of data, we saw this in the assistive technology field, where there was a lot of discussion about products. We are looking at patents and technologies. So we had to come up with a concordance table between an ISO standard on products, the API list of WHO, and the patent classification symbols. But the same issue may arise in a lot of different areas. Similarly, licensing data, litigation data is not exhaustive. So very often we end up reporting on what is available. And this is why, for instance, there is a role for organizations such as IGO to play. We have our standards colleagues who are working on standardizing the exchange of some type of information, such as the legal status information that was mentioned earlier, to make sure about the availability and also comparability of the information. But there are still some information that is missing, and there is some work to be done in harmonizing and standardizing this information.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very useful. I actually wanted to turn back to our last two speakers, and so our colleague from WHO and also Dayong. In your work, do you see sort of any evidence for what is WHO pre-qualification and the increase of local or regional production? Is that something which can be actually shown in terms of the activities on the PQ front? And the same question in a way to Dayong, is there any evidence we can take from trade data, so in terms of flows from low and middle income countries, exports of pharmaceuticals? Is there any indication that there's sort of local manufacturing capacity growing in these regions? That would be something, I think, in terms of evidence from both of you to hear. Thank you. Dayong, would you like to go first?
Thank you, Roger. I think this is a good question, probably because we try to do some studies, especially now we have a project to look at the PPEs to see how developing country can build up capacity on those things. Maybe we have some methodology, try to identify the similar products could be produced, which is already produced in the region to help. But this is still in a very initial stage. But for pharmaceuticals, like what I said, because we have a problem with this granularity of the trade data, because trade data is not really detailed enough to do a very good analysis, even for the developed countries. It's because there's only a handful, I think 20 or 30 tariff lines cover all the medicines plus active ingredients. But there's must be millions of different kind of chemicals, and that's go through the supply chain. So we did some test, but so far it hasn't been successful. But we did a study on antibiotics last year. So we see the antibiotics is a quite good story because there's a lot of production really from India to export antibiotics finished from pharmaceuticals to US. And at the same time, India import a lot of ingredients from China. So that's one of the famous story at the beginning of the pandemic. So the interruption of the supply chain. We did some work on that. From that experience, we know the disconnection between this trade and production data. Basically, we need the help from industry, at least to map the supply chain, which product, which medicine was produced with which ingredients, and then we can start to look for the more granular, more detailed data and try to establish some evidence. So far, I think unfortunately we don't have much to offer at this area.
Thank you so much, Dayong, and I understand that our colleague from WHO had to leave us. So, which is also a good moment then to move to the end and the concluding remarks for this webinar. Before we close this event, let me briefly summarize or make an attempt to summarize some of the key takeaways, and this will be by no means comprehensive, given the wealth of information, ideas, and contributions we have listened to in the course of this afternoon. But maybe I can try to capture at least some of those elements. And certainly what I heard in a number of contributions is the call for an integrated approach That includes multiple factors which affect access to medical technologies. Certainly, when it comes to technology transfer, the call for, and again, a comprehensive ecosystem without which transfer would not really function, and the need to talk to all actors in order to make this integrated approach happen. So that I think is an interesting point to bear in mind. The second interesting point which came up in the first panel is what I thought, there was reference to cooperation that is needed in order to secure access to medical technologies. And then interestingly, this was put into the context of with or without the TRIPS waiver, which is currently under consideration. So whatever we have as an outcome of that discussion, there's a clear call for more cooperation, which again I think is a point worthwhile sort of retaining. Then there has been some discussion about TRIPS flexibilities. The need to actively implement it and use those flexibilities, but also the years of concern about the current difficulties that some countries at least face to make active use of those flexibilities. And in this context, we've heard, again, I think some interesting ideas. One sort of comes from Jamie, the idea to have some sort of model laws for TRIPS flexibilities, but also the call for clarification of how certain flexibilities in the TRIPS agreement apply. So these are, I think, the takeaways for TRIPS flexibilities. There has been, I think, some support for the DG's third waiver approach also voiced in the discussions. And then in technology transfers in the discussions, we had, I think, an interesting idea which came from Sudarshan about the global fund to buy not only intellectual property, but also the technology as a basis for the transfer of technology and know-how. There's been, I think, an interesting point made by DNDi about their practice of using gold standard licensing terms, which brings me to the question whether this could be one of the many ingredients for discussions of voluntary principles for technology transfer. And we've had also a point made about the waiver, which is currently again under consideration, not being enough to transfer technology, that many other ingredients were needed, and also that there was really a need to look into the many trade barriers which are out there in order to enable this transfer. In the session on local production, I think we had a sort of very good readout of the many sort of sticking points which are out there in order to enable local production, but also of the benefits for sort of taking a decision to indeed foster such production. Again, like in earlier sessions, we heard about the many ingredients which were needed in order to foster local production, including transfer of technology and know-how. And we also heard about the need for this to focus not only on production, but at least in the sort of mid to long-term perspective, on R&D. And then finally, I think the session on evidence, empirical evidence, was very interesting because it brought to the forefront the existence of important gaps in terms of access to the information that is needed to come up with empirical evidence. There was also the very strong point made about transparency being a crucial factor. And also what Dayang said at the end, the call for the common methodologies to share data, which certainly for what is trade data would greatly help the analytical sort of function that the WTO can add to this particular area of work. With that, again, this is only an attempt to summarize some of the key takeaways. I would like to especially thank our 12 expert speakers who have all made very valuable contributions to this webinar. Many thanks for making yourselves available and for sharing your insights with the participants. I know in these times, 3 hours means a lot, so I'm really appreciative of your efforts to be there with us. for the entirety of this webinar. I would also express my sincere gratitude to colleagues from the IPD team and the many other colleagues behind the scene, without whom this event could not have taken place. To conclude, many thanks also to the numerous participants who have joined us from around the world for your interest in this topic and for your questions and comments, which have made this webinar a truly interactive experience. And a final announcement, we will continue this series of webinars as part of the virtual course on trade and public health next Wednesday, same time, 1300. And the topic next week will be delivering medical technologies and vaccines to end users. With that, many thanks to all of you, and I wish you a pleasant evening or morning or whatever is left of the day. Thank you.